I would like to welcome you to the analysis of my round 2 chess game against a 1900 in the Munich Chess Festival. This game is special to me because I played almost a perfect game. I scored a 95% accuracy, and my opponent also played super well with 90% accuracy. I hope you enjoy. Starting off this game, I had the white pieces, and I must say I played really well in the opening. I had my book knowledge there. I have the white pieces, and so far in the opening, it's all good. After d5, I take back with the pawn. Knight takes, and so far I'm still in book. I've prepared rook e1 for this game and went rook e1, and after bishop g4, there's a few moves for white, but I chose knight bd2 first, knight back to attack my bishop, and now h3. This is like the best procedure of moves. Now, the best move for black is to actually go back with bishop h6, and then I would go back here, giving out a pawn, and this is actually still theory, and here I would sack my queen in a very crazy line, but none of this happened. I think I outplayed my opponent in theory, which is always great, and he took my bishop. And this has some serious repercussions out of the opening. As you'll see, the advantage I accrue from this move is not in terms of pieces. It's really in terms of energy on the board. It's called initiative. Knight takes back, attacking this pawn so many times, and attacking this bishop. So if you just play a move moving your bishop, I just take this pawn. So bishop takes is forced, I take back with the queen, and once again, this pawn is attacked twice. So black has to defend. And now I have what is called that initiative. So I keep that initiative by playing forcing moves. b4 forces a bishop move. The bishop moves, keeping this long diagonal all sweet. And now I go with a4, another move forcing or threatening to win a piece. My opponent goes with a6 here to give a square for the bishop. And here I took so long to try to figure out a good procedure for white. Try to pause the video and solve. After so long, I came up with bishop a3. This is the first move of the game that I take more than like 45 seconds. And this is a move that's interesting. I'm threatening to win material with this double attack here. And so my opponent defends this by going rook f7. It's really a move that to me looked extremely awkward. The rook does not belong here. The natural move would be rook e8. And now I was sure that white has a better procedure, a winning procedure. Try to find it with the white pieces. This took me so long. I took a 20-minute turn here to figure it out. And I finally came up with b5, which is the obvious move to try to win this pawn. But for me, it didn't work. After b5, first of all, black doesn't have to take, but I only calculated takes, and after knight a5, here, if my knight is attacked, I only looked 2 moves in, though. I only looked at takes, and I couldn't find an advantage for the white pieces here, which was really discouraging and super frustrating. But the best move I learned afterwards from the engine is bishop b4. Here I'm pressuring this knight 3 times with this move, forcing my opponent to take, and we like taking these doubled pawns, threatening c5 to trap the bishop. And with the combined threat of the pawn on b7, here white wins a pawn, simply put. I was completely mind-boggled by this after the game. I went with rook ad1, knowing that b5 is good. Rook ad1 is a mistake in contrast. But let me tell you something super special about this game. After like move 30, at a certain point in the game, I will tell you that the white pieces does not make a singular mistake for the rest of the game. And I found it really impressive of myself afterwards. So my opponent goes rook d7, and now it looks like black is picking back up the steam. Like here, the doubling on this weak pawn on d3, and it doesn't look as obvious for white. So I go with the plan b5, takes, and now knight a5. Pressuring this knight here, so I thought to take this bishop and double these pawns, create a weakness. And here I go with this natural seeming move, queen e4, which is inaccurate. And I realized it afterwards just because of my opponent's moves. But the best move here, which might come as a surprise to some of you, is actually queen e2. Queen e2 to pressure this and threaten this here. And let's say what was played in the game, something like this. Now I have d4. And the idea is that we open up the e file for my queen to check this king. The king moves, and now bishop e7. And the white pieces are just planted into the enemy territory and are doing super well, and we'll be winning this pawn back very shortly. Something that I missed here. Instead, queen e4, you feel it immediately because that so-called initiative that white has been building up for the entire game just evaporates. Black goes rook c8, threatening this pawn. I defend it. Best move. Rook d5, threatening this pawn. No defense. If I go c5, rook takes c4 here, and this pawn is pinned. So suddenly I'm met with the fact that I can't defend the pawn, and I lost the initiative all in 2 moves, where the first 15 moves of the game I was absolutely playing explosive, and might I say even winning at one point. So here I scramble, and I fail to find f4 and queen e2. I want to touch on queen e2, which is very interesting. This makes it so that you can't take the pawn for free because I have d4 threatening the rook, and if you come back, I have d takes e5. And now the rook is pinned, so you can't take back here. And if you take back with the pawn, I can takes, and now queen a2 is pinning this rook and winning it. After you defend your rook, I have rook takes e5, just winning a full rook. Insanity. So I missed this because I'm human, and I go queen f5, which seems like a good move, also for reasons that you can't take this directly because I have f4 coming in very sharp. My opponent goes with a move that now completely takes me off guard. Queen d7. Being very patient about this pawn, and the fact that it's super weak and black can take it at any time of the day, and also just kicking my queen. And here white is met with 2 difficult options, very difficult options. Think of it this way. You're playing for the win as the white pieces, and you have 2 options here. You could either trade these queens and have 0 winning plans in this position, or you could go back, give this pawn clean, and try to fight for compensation. I chose the latter, queen f3. Here you can't take with the queen because I have c4, which is a fork between 2 pieces, but if you take with the rook, I had prepared d4 with the similar thing that we saw earlier, right? With takes and this little pin here, which is very nice. So my opponent can't take the pawn yet, but the advantage is so felt after rook d8. And now these pieces triple on my d3 pawn and attack my b5 pawn. I'm in trouble. So I go with d4. I sack a pawn, and the idea is that if you take here, I have rook e7 that now completely invades this 7th rank and is winning for white because I just have a thrilling attack. g6 and now queen c7, and this is actually lights out for white. It's crazy. So you can't take, but at the same time, knight c4 lets in. And my opponent played spectacularly here. The knight is super luscious on c4. This b5 pawn is falling freely, and white's counterplay is at a net 0. So I play queen e2, attacking this knight. Queen takes, and now I take this pawn. And black has to find the right move here that is practically good for a win. The good for a win move is just taking the pawn back, maintaining the pressure along the file, the defense on this e5 pawn, and the control with this knight on c4. Here I reckon that black would eventually beat the white pieces, even though this position is said to be equal by Stockfish 16, which is insane. My opponent took a really rash decision that completely transforms the game. I mean, blows it off his feet. He takes rook, he trades rooks, so he takes my rooks, and now he takes back the pawn. Black is up a pawn here, but white has serious counterplay that wins back a pawn by force. I check the king a second time, and now I take this pawn. And for the next 30 moves, up until move 52, white will make no other than 1 inaccuracy. That's all the mistakes I will make for the rest of the game. So, this endgame is very interesting. Black has a centralized knight, where white has a thematically superior bishop. The bishop is not superior here, although on d4 it might be considered a better piece than this knight. But for now, this knight is better. The queens want to be centralized, so you'll see our queens fighting for one of these central squares, which gives just optimal control of the chessboard. This king is weak. It's weaker than my king, and that is a huge advantage for the white pieces, and ultimately what will give the white pieces a push in some counterplaying chances. My opponent, after a long think, played the best move, queen c6. Brushing off my queen, I really don't want a queen trade. It's hard to win from this position on. It would probably just be a draw. I am playing for an absolute win. There's 100 points difference between my opponent and I. White is not taking anything other than a win. Queen b8. The idea of queen b8 is that I just want to stay on this pawn. I don't want to let the black pieces centralize their queen with queen e4. So I'm just being a little bit annoying here. Black moves their pawn, b5, fixing my pawn on c4 here, and I go with queen g8, immediately seeking counterplay with some bishop f8 and queen takes g7 things. Queen e4, black gets their centralized queen, but right off the bat, I play bishop f8. This is still a completely equal position. It's completely equal. I'm just looking for a chink in the armor, a crack in the ceiling, somewhere to pierce. Bishop f8. I'm threatening to take this pawn. You can deal with it two ways. The defensive way, which is pretty passive but is very solid, or the counter-attacking way. Both lead to a draw, both are draws, both are equally as good. My opponent chose the aggressive queen e1 check. But after king h2, you have to play extremely precise to draw this game, and if you don't play precise, you risk the entire drawing chances. And here, I saw the combination for black, and I was really hoping, you won't hear me say that word often, but I was hoping my opponent would not find the draw by force. In fact, if you don't play the draw by force here, you are immediately less good off as the black pieces. The draw by force, you might have guessed it, is knight f3 check, sacrificing a knight. The obvious takes is just met with a perpetual check here, right? The pieces just trade rolls for 3 moves and black claims a draw. But my opponent missed here is that after king g3, it is still a draw for black. And I saw this during the game, and I was like, oh no, he can actually get a way out of this. Here, black has to play really nicely though. Queen e5 check, king takes, and now queen takes c3. If you play queen f5 with the idea of a repetition check, eventually black gets to that queen side and no more checks will happen. So black needs to take here, and whatever I do, if I do this blunder, it's over because of queen b3, which is very important because my king cannot cross the other side of the board to try to take refuge. So I would just have to go back and check, 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 and it will eventually be a draw. My opponent did not play this. After king h2, my opponent played queen takes f2, the free seeming pawn. And in my head, verbatim, my brain went, the losing move. As I was going down to write my move, I was like, that's the losing move. This gives me 2 pawns in a row with check. And here I have to convert a pawn up in this endgame. I have a question for you, the audience. What would you choose? An endgame with bishop versus knight, or an endgame with queen versus queen? If you had to trade off one of these 2 pieces to try to convert, what would you choose and why? So we'll give the answer to this in a few moves as we proceed. So I go queen g8 check, king d7, queen g3. By the way, this is the range of moves that it's pretty much all best or excellent move. I'll just put the game review on and you'll see that it's like no mistakes. So queen g3 I play to try to trade queens and playing against this mating threat that was there on the board. So the queen goes back, and this is my only inaccurate move I think now, is queen f4. So I was playing a progressing move that still prevents black's good moves here, queen f4. But I missed a move that I actually played later on in the game. So queen f4, threatening this pawn, and now king e6. And this is probably my best sequence of the game. It's a long game, 52 moves, and these are probably my best 2 moves. Here, white could easily go bishop g2, threaten this pawn, and force the knight back. And this really looks clean. But I saw this, evaluated and thought that my bishop is just absolutely trashed on g7. So instead, I opted for the way better bishop c5, which I reckon is the best move in this position, and with the idea that I want to circumvent back to the d4 square and threaten along this diagonal. You remember way earlier on in this game where I said this bishop would be superior to this knight if it were on d4? I'm finally making that dream realized. So knight f3, and here my opponent is playing very tricky. This is the question. Do you take this knight and give queen e5 check and give back the bishop for a queen ending? Or do you play king g3 and eventually try to trade queens and go for a bishop versus knight? If you know your endgames, the bishop versus knight has the most chances, as queen endgames are very tough to win and convert because if your king is weak, there are a lot of chances of perpetual checks in that endgame with a draw for black. So I went king g3, my king is on an adventure here, and now knight d2. On knight e5, which was a better move, I would have just played bishop d4, pressured, and eventually tried to convert that. But knight d2 is like a gift to me. I was super enthusiastic when I saw this move because it just lets the white pieces trade queens. Queen g4 check, queen takes, and now king takes. Best move all along, and I have an outside passed pawn on the flank here, which is very telling. My opponent goes knight e4, and the final question of the day. This is a super important question to this game. Where do you put your bishop in this fork? Do you settle your bishop on b4 and solidly protect against this pawn pushing? Or do you play bishop d4 and centralize your bishop along these two diagonals? But there could be tricks with king d5 and b4. Ladies and gentlemen, I found the best move here that is the most risky move too. Fortune favors the bold, bishop d4. So I keep some pressure on f6 and I centralize my bishop for all squares. And my opponent saw a trick and thought that he would be winning, and I knew that that trick didn't work. And that's the beauty of chess. The player that wins is ultimately the player that makes the best decisions, that calculates the best, and evaluates the best. And I believe I outplayed here. After king d5, with the idea of pushing b4, I go king f5 and ignore it completely. Well, I don't ignore it, I let it happen, let's say. b4 is now played, overloading my c3 pawn, and if I were to take, I lose my bishop. If I don't take, this pawn rolls down the board and queens. So I played a brilliant move. C takes b4. I had foreseen this before the queen trade and really liked this line. Here, after king takes bishop, this knight is absolutely useless compared to my two outside passers. The king defends the knight, and the knight defends the pawn. If the king moves, the knight is hanging. If the knight moves, the pawn is hanging. So at first, I just wanted to streamline this pawn and play like a fox in the chicken coop type thing, literally giving it up. And this was my idea. And it completely works, even on another line by black. Even if you go knight c7, this is fine. The knight will give itself for the pawn, and my pawn is just in time to win. And if you try another way to put your knight in the circuit, this is what really scared me here, knight c3. This is still absolutely fine because I have g4 here, taking up the squares for this knight, and this pawn will queen. So this all worked in my head. I was ready to play it. And then I told myself, why are you complicating your life? If I run this h-pawn, you cannot stop it. I realize this. I'm starting to calculate. Because of this thing of the king being dependent on this knight, the knight being dependent on the king, the pawn being dependent on the knight, I can just run my pawn. And there's absolutely nothing you can do without giving a piece or just not stopping it. So I go h4, king d5, h5, check. Of course, this pawn is more valuable than this one, so I don't take this pawn here. King g6. If you ever take this pawn, the king endgame is completely winning, right? I don't have to show it, do I? King here and then king here. We pick up this pawn and this pawn rolls down. King e6, h6, knight back, h7. There's nothing you can do. I'm queening. My opponent resigned, and after 52 moves, out of 52 moves in this game review right now, I'm going to send a screenshot to my editor. I played 2 mistakes and 3 inaccuracies. I played 5 overall mistakes in 52 moves. That is pretty clean. Tomorrow is a very special recap. It's a special edition recap. I am basically analyzing that game IRL with an international master, so don't miss out. See you tomorrow.